It was the autumn of 2009 when 27-year-old Sylvie Marceau first understood, with a cold and absolute clarity, that the world had decided her family's land was in the way. The notice came on a Thursday, tucked between a hydro bill and a flyer for the new hardware store in Sainte-Cécile. It was printed on heavy cream paper that felt nothing like the thin, honest envelopes her grandmother Yvette had kept in the kitchen drawer for 40 years. The language was careful and corporate, the kind of language designed to sound reasonable while saying something unreasonable. It announced the arrival of Le Domaine des Pins Blancs, a boutique wilderness retreat and four-season spa to be developed on the 600 acres of mixed boreal forest that bordered the eastern edge of the Marceau property. It spoke of economic opportunity and regional revitalization. It mentioned, almost as an aside, that the Marceau sugar bush and dairy operation, 112 acres running along Rang Sainte-Hélène, 45 minutes north of Tremblant, would find itself in a position of, and these were the exact words, adjacency to significant development activity for an extended period of time. Sylvie read the notice twice at the kitchen table. Then she set it down next to her coffee cup and looked out the window at the sugar maples her great-great-grandfather Edouard had planted in 1921. They were enormous now, their crowns touched. In the October light, they burned orange and copper against a sky the color of cold iron. She understood what adjacency to significant development activity meant. She'd grown up in the Laurentians. She knew what a backhoe sounded like at 6 in the morning. She knew what blasting did to a hillside, and she knew, with the particular knowledge of someone who had spent her life reading weather and soil, and the behavior of animals, exactly what that kind of disruption would do to her maple sap yields, to her small herd of Canadian heritage cattle, and to the 32 beehives she kept in the stand of basswood trees at the property's northern edge. Let me tell you about those maples. The Marceau sugar bush was not large by commercial standards. It was not the kind of operation that shipped syrup to grocery chains across the province. It was something older and quieter than that. Yvette Marceau had always called it une forêt qui travaille, a forest that works. The trees had been tapped by hand every February for 4 generations, the sap collected in metal buckets on wooden yokes the way Edouard had done it, boiled in the sugar shack that still stood at the center of the bush, its tin roof patched 3 times and never replaced outright because, as Yvette had said, a roof that has been fixed is a roof that has been paid attention to. The syrup that came out of that evaporator was the darkest amber-grade bee that most people in the region had ever tasted. It carried the specific character of that hillside, of that particular soil, of that microclimate where cold nights and warm days came in the precise sequence that made the sap run sweet and long. The cattle were heritage breed, small and hardy, the kind of animal that had been bred for generations to survive a Quebec winter without complaint. They produced milk with a fat content that mainstream dairy operations considered inefficient, and that Sylvie considered a gift. She had learned to make cheese from it, a soft, washed rind round she called simply Rang Sainte-Hélène, and a firm aged wheel she made in small batches and sold only at the Saturday market in the village. People drove from as far as Mont Tremblant to buy it. The bees were her grandmother's particular inheritance. Yvette had kept bees for 50 years, and when she died, she left Sylvie not just the hives, but the knowledge of how to read them. Sylvie could tell from the pitch of the hum whether a colony was content or queenless. She knew the difference between a swarm and a panic. She knew that her basswood honey, harvested in a single narrow window in late July, was unlike any other honey produced in the Laurentians, and that it had everything to do with the specific stand of old-growth basswood at the north end of the property, and nothing to do with anything she had done herself. She was, as she often said, a custodian, not a manufacturer. The general understanding in the village, once word got out about Le Domaine des Pains Blancs, was that the Marceau girl had gotten lucky, that kind of money landing next door to a small dairy operation. People nodded at each other over coffee at the Dépanneur Hébert. She'd sell for twice what the land was worth and set herself up somewhere nice. That was the sensible thing. That was what anyone with sense would do. Sylvie's neighbor, old Mr. Carbonneau, who had known her grandmother and who meant genuinely well, stopped her in the parking lot of the Caisse Populaire. "Sylvie," he said, his breath making clouds in the November air, "those development people, they have deep pockets. You've put years into that place? Yes, but you're still young. You could start fresh." He patted her arm. "Your grandmother would understand. Times change." He was being kind. They were all being kind, in the way that people are kind when they have already decided what you should do and are trying to help you arrive at the same conclusion without too much friction. They were wrong about what Yvette would have understood. The representative from the development companies arrived 6 weeks after the notice. His name was Mr. Falconer. He was from Montreal, and he wore a coat that was too thin for the temperature and shoes with leather soles that were already ruined by the gravel of her lane before he reached the porch steps. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of groomed assurance that comes from spending decades in rooms where no one disagrees with you to your face. He did not come inside. He stood in her driveway, looking at the sugar shack and the cattle shelter and the row of hive boxes along the north, tree-lined the way a person looks at a problem they have already decided how to solve. "Miss Marceau," he said. He pronounced it autres och, hard and flat, the Montreal French of a man who had grown up Anglophone and learned just enough to function. "I'll be direct with you. Our project is moving forward regardless. The question is simply whether you participate in the upside or spend the next 3 years watching us build from your kitchen window." Sylvie said nothing. She had her grandmother's quality of silence. Not hostile, not uncomfortable, just present, the way the forest is present, in a way that makes you aware of how much noise you've been making. "We're prepared to offer you," he continued, "significantly above assessed value, enough that you could relocate the entire operation with capital left over. There are excellent properties available in the eastern townships, more accessible markets, better infrastructure." He named a number. It was the kind of number that, if you said it out loud in the Dépanneur Hébert, would make people set down their coffee cups. "The property is not for sale," Sylvie said. Her voice was even and unhurried, the way water is even and unhurried when it has found the route it intends to travel. Mr. Falconer smiled, patient and a little condescending, the smile of a man who has heard no used as an opening position many times. "Miss Marceau, I want to be transparent with you. There will be blasting for the foundation work. Road construction on the forestry road to the north. 18 months of heavy equipment, minimum. That is not an environment conducive to the kind of operation you're running." "I understand," she said. "The property is not for sale." He left. The gravel crunched under his ruined shoes all the way back to his car. He had been right about the disruption. The first blast came on the 3rd of March, before the sap had started to run. Sylvie was in the sugar shack, checking the evaporator fittings when the hillside shook. Her cattle broke through the east fence at the shock of it, all 11 of them, streaming through a gap into the north field, and it took her most of an afternoon in knee-deep snow to bring them back. The fine dust that settled over the following weeks was something no one had warned her about, specifically a persistent reddish grit that coated the tap lines and the bucket rims and required her to wash every vessel before the season started. The sap yield that year was down 17%. It was not catastrophic, but it was a message. By summer, the noise had become a presence in itself, a grinding mechanical drone that started with the light and ran until the light quit. The cattle were unsettled. Heritage breeds, for all their hardiness, are sensitive animals, and animals that are unsettled do not thrive. Her milk production dropped, and the character of the milk changed in small ways that she noticed, and that her cheese reflected. The rounds she pulled from the aging cave that fall were slightly off. Not wrong, exactly, but not right either, and she knew the difference even when her customers didn't. The bees were the worst of it. The development company had brought in construction lighting that ran through the short summer nights, and that artificial sky glow bled over the ridge and down into the basewood hollow. Bees are creatures of light in a way that is almost religious. Their orientation, their foraging patterns, their sense of time, all of it depends on the sun and the particular quality of natural darkness. That summer, her basewood honey harvest was a third of what it had been the year before. Some hives weakened and had to be combined. She lost 2 colonies entirely to a stress-related infection she had never seen before in 32 hives. It felt like watching someone take a pencil and slowly, methodically, erase the things that made her land itself. Now let me tell you about the knowledge she carried. Sylvie had not gone to university. She had taken a semester of agricultural college in St. Hyacinthe and come home after Christmas when Yvette's health began to fail. And she had never gone back. What she had instead was something that does not appear in any course catalog: 40 years of Yvette Marceau's accumulated attention to this specific piece of the Laurentians. Yvette had kept records the way serious farmers keep records, not to satisfy a government form, but because the land kept changing. And the only way to understand what it was telling you was to write down what you heard. There were 8 composition notebooks in the drawer of the kitchen desk, each one filled in Yvette's careful looping script: rainfall dates, sap runs start and end, which hives needed supering and when, the precise date each year when the basewood bloom peaked, observations about which stands of trees sheltered the cattle best in a northwest wind. Yvette had been a practical woman who did not waste words on sentiment, but there was one entry from the spring of 1987 that Sylvie had read so many times she could have said it in her sleep. The wind off the new subdivision to the south has been difficult. It comes through the gap in the spruce line where we lost 3 trees to ice last January. I think we were wrong not to replant that gap immediately. A living windbreak does 2 things a fence cannot. It grows stronger every year, and it changes the air, not just blocks it. Next autumn, I am going to plant a double row in that gap: balsam fir and white cedar, with red osier dogwood on the outer edge for the early color. It will take 10 years to matter. Plant it anyway. It will take 10 years to matter. Plant it anyway. Sylvie sat with that sentence for a long time. In the winter of her second hard year, she sat with it in the sugar shack, watching the sap boil and thinking about what her grandmother had meant, not just about the windbreak, but about time itself, about the difference between people who act in the time they have and people who act in the time the land requires. She went looking, that February, through the storage room off the sugar shack, where Yvette had kept everything that did not have another place, and, behind a stack of old evaporator pans and 3 pairs of snowshoes with broken bindings, she found the map. It was hand-drawn on a piece of drafting paper that had gone brown at the edges. Yvette had drawn the entire 112 acres in pencil, with the property boundaries marked in ink and every significant feature noted: the sugar bush, the basewood hollow, the creek that ran along the south edge, the ridge to the north where the property met the old Crown forestry land, and along the eastern boundary, the boundary that now shared a fence line with Le Domaine des Pins Blancs. Yvette had sketched a planting plan, a dense, layered buffer, white spruce and balsam fir on the outer edge for year-round screening, a middle row of trembling aspen for quick height, and on the inside a mix of serviceberry, hazelnut, and wild apple for what the note in the margin called les travailleurs, the workers, the species that would feed the bees and the birds and hold the bank of the small seasonal stream that ran in a ditch along the fence line. There was a date at the bottom of the map, 91, and a note, Ne l'ai jamais planté, toujours en retard. I never planted it, always too late. Yvette had seen the problem coming, not from a resort, but from the gradual expansion of a neighboring property to the east in the early 1990s, and she had drawn the answer. And then the pressure had eased and the urgency had passed, and the plan had gone into a box with the broken snowshoes. Now the pressure was back, and the plan was still there, and Sylvie had it in her hands. She made 2 phone calls. The first was to a tree nursery in Mont Laurier. The second was to her cousin Dennis, who had a pickup truck and owed her a favor dating back to a flooded basement in 2006. That spring, between the end of maple season and the start of hive inspections, she began to plant. The nursery owner in Mont Laurier had given her an honest assessment when she described what she wanted and why. What you're describing is a serious windbreak and sound buffer, he'd said. On that scale, it's a 5 to 7 year project before you see real benefit. 10 before it's mature. He'd paused. You should start this year. She bought what she could afford. 240 trees in the first year. A mix of spruce and balsam fir for the outer row, 60 trembling aspens in the middle, and 60 serviceberry shrubs for the inner edge. The aspens went in first because they grew fastest. Her cousin Dennis dug holes for 2 weekends in a row and asked no questions, which was its own kind of kindness. A forester she found through the Regional Agricultural Extension Office came out in May to look at what she was doing and stayed for 3 hours, walking the fence line with her, suggesting adjustments to the spacing, telling her which species to add in the second planting season to fill gaps in the sound attenuation profile. The aspens will give you visual screening in 3 years, he said. The spruce won't matter acoustically for 8 or 9, but here, he pointed to a low spot along the creek ditch. If you plant a thick row of red osier dogwood, dense enough to walk through sideways, you'll buffer that light bleed along the ground. The bees' problem isn't just the overhead glow. It's the light at ground level confusing their sense of horizon. She had not known that. She wrote it down. I want to be honest about what the next 2 years were actually like, because the stories people tell about patience usually skip the part where patience is genuinely terrible. The aspens went in that May, and Sylvie felt, for approximately 48 hours, the specific satisfaction of having done the right thing. Then, the construction on the other side of the fence resumed with renewed energy, and the feeling dissolved into the noise. She planted through maple season and around hive inspections and between batches of cheese aging in the cave. She drove to Mont Laurier 3 more times for trees and once for replacement spruce seedlings. After a dry spell, took 8 of the outer row plantings in July. She watered by hand with a 5-gallon tank on the back of the 4-wheeler, which was slow enough work that she had a great deal of time to think. And thinking, when you are tired and uncertain, has a way of turning against you. The village opinion had not improved. The construction had brought work to the area, flagging jobs, catering contracts for the crew lunches, equipment rentals, and that goodwill had extended to a generalized feeling that the resort was a net positive, and that anyone in its way was being, however understandably, stubborn. Old Mr. Carbonneau stopped asking when she was going to sell. He started asking if she was doing all right. which was worse, because it was the question people ask when they have decided you are making a mistake, but have given up saying so directly. On dit que tu plantes des arbres, he said one afternoon. They say you're planting trees. He said it gently, the way you might say on dit que tu parles à la lune. I am, she said. Along the fence line, the whole east boundary. He looked at her for a moment. That's a big project for one person. I have Denny's. Denny, he said, and shook his head very slightly in a way that communicated several things without being specific about any of them. The moment of real doubt came in October of the second year, the kind of doubt that does not feel like uncertainty but like recognition. The sudden, nauseating possibility that you have read the situation wrong from the beginning and that everyone around you has been seeing something you couldn't see. It was a cold rain, the kind that turns the gravel lane to soup and comes in sideways off the ridge, and she had been planting the final stretch of the inner Serviceberry row since first light. Her knees were soaked through. The forester had told her to plant this row in a staggered pattern with specific spacing, and she kept having to recheck her notes because her fingers were cold enough that she wasn't sure her measurements were right. Across the fence, through the bare trees, she could see the main lodge structure of Le Domaine des Pins Blancs taking its final shape, a long building of timber and dark glass, lit from inside, enormous and solid and already beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, effortlessly, and at great cost to everything near them. A generator ran somewhere on that side. It had been running every night for 16 months. She had stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a refrigerator hum. And then, in moments like this one, sudden and cold, she heard it again as if for the first time. Steady, self-assured, utterly indifferent. She sat down in the mud with a serviceberry shrub in her lap and thought, clearly and without drama, that her grandmother had been wrong, that the map in the storage room was the drawing of an old woman who had seen a problem and imagined a solution and never tested whether the solution was real. That she, Sylvie, had taken that imagining and spent 2 years and most of her savings on it, and that the trees along the fence line were still barely shoulder height, and that the resort was going to open in the spring, and that the noise and the light were not going anywhere. She thought about the number Mr. Falconer had named. She thought about the eastern townships, about the cheese markets in the cantons de l'Est, about the possibility of starting over somewhere smaller and quieter and unbothered. She sat in the mud for a while. The serviceberry shrub dripped on her jeans. Then she thought about the 8 composition notebooks in the kitchen drawer, and the pencil on that old piece of drafting paper, and the note at the bottom in her grandmother's handwriting. Ne l'ai jamais planté, toujours en retard. Yvette had not written, I thought about it, and decided it was not worth the effort. She had written, I was always too late. That was a different thing entirely. Regret is not the same as doubt. Yvette had known the answer. She had just not had time enough. Sylvie had the time. She had chosen to use it. She picked up her planting bar, worked it into the ground, and opened the hole for the next shrub. Le Domaine des Pins Blancs opened the following June, with the kind of coverage that new wilderness retreats attract when they are expensive enough to be aspirational and remote enough to feel exclusive. A piece in Montreal Gazette, a feature in a Toronto travel supplement, a long Instagram presence built around photographs of steam rising from an outdoor soaking pool against a backdrop of snow-dusted pines. The resort was, by any honest measure, beautiful. Sylvie acknowledged this without difficulty. Beautiful things and right things were not always opposed or embraced. By that first summer, the aspens along the east fence had reached 4 meters. They were not a wall yet, but they were a suggestion of one, a shimmering, rustling presence that broke the sight line and filtered some of the noise into something less intrusive. The bees, she noticed, had begun to stabilize. 2 of the weakened colonies had rallied. Her basswood honey yield was still below its historical average, but it was trending up, and the character of the honey, that particular intensity she had always thought of as the honey's opinion of the land, was coming back. She sold her cheese at the Saturday market in the village, and at a small honor system farm stand at the end of her lane, a wooden table under a roof her cousin Dennis had built from scrap lumber, with a cash box and a little chalkboard that listed what was available that week. Nothing fancy, the kind of thing that works only because people are fundamentally honest when they feel like they are participating in something rather than purchasing from it. The first unusual customer appeared in August, 14 months after the resort opened. Her name was Miss Paradis, and she was the food and beverage director for Le Domaine des Pins Blancs. And she arrived on a Tuesday morning in a resort-branded vehicle and stood at the farm stand for a long time, reading the chalkboard before she bought 2 wheels of the soft cheese and 3 jars of honey and left her card tucked under the cash box. Sylvie called the number that evening from the kitchen, standing at the window where the maples were beginning to turn gold at the tips. Miss Paradis was precise and professional. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I tasted your cheese yesterday evening, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Our menu concept has always centered on regional authenticity, but we have been sourcing from distributors in Montreal, and the product is fine, but it is not authentic. It is not this. We've had guests asking at the front desk. One of them mentioned a farm stand within walking distance. A few of them walked there themselves." "I know," Sylvie said. She had noticed the resort-load fleece jackets appearing at the stand, 2 or 3 per week, asking careful, serious questions about whether the honey was raw and whether the cattle were pastured year-round. "I'm calling, ask whether you would consider supplying the resort, Miss Paradis said. "I have a meeting with our general manager and concrete proposal. I'd like to be able to present." "I'd be willing to have a conversation," Sylvie said. "Have your manager contact my lawyer to arrange a meeting. I'll need at least 2 weeks' notice." There was a brief pause on the line. "Of course," Miss Paradis said, and something in the evenness of her own voice told Sylvie that the conversation had gone differently than she had expected. The meeting took place not in the resort's glass and timber boardroom, but at Sylvie's kitchen table, because Sylvie had said so, and because she saw no reason to conduct her business anywhere but where she actually conducted her business. She served coffee in the plain, heavy mugs Yvette had bought at a church sale in 1978. Her lawyer, a woman from Santa Agathe named Miss Bouchard, not the Isabelle Bouchard on Sylvie's avoided list, but a different woman entirely, a sharp and unhurried litigator who had spent 20 years doing agricultural property law in the Laurentians, sat beside her with a yellow notepad. Across the table, Mr. Falconer, the same man who had stood in her driveway 4 years earlier predicting her ruin, now accompanied by a younger lawyer and the resort's general manager, a man named Mr. Doyle, who was polished and well prepared, and clearly unused to meeting rooms that smelled of wood smoke and aging cheese. Let me tell you about what happened next, because it mattered. Sylvie let Miss Bouchard do the talking. That was the arrangement, and it was the right one, because Miss Bouchard was better at this than Sylvie would have been, not because Sylvie lacked confidence, but because restraint is a skill, and Ms. Bouchard had been practicing it for decades. The terms were straightforward. They were also, for the resort's team, unexpected in their specificity. Sylvie would supply a fixed quantity of cheese and honey per week, quantities she had calculated precisely based on what her land and animals could produce without strain. not what Mr. Doyle's menu required. The price was not a wholesale price. The price was not a wholesale price. It was a retail price, with a procurement surcharge reflecting the inconvenience of dealing with a single small producer who reserved the right to reduce supply during any season in which animal welfare or land health indicators fell below her own thresholds. She would define those thresholds. They were not negotiable. The supply contract would include an exclusivity arrangement. Le Domaine des Pains Blancs would not serve or retail any other locally produced artisan soft cheese or basswood honey from the Laurentians region while the contract was in effect. If they wanted to tell their guests they served local cheese, they would serve hers and no one else's. And in exchange, they would not approach any neighboring producer with a competing arrangement without her written consent. Then Ms. Bouchard slid a single-page document across the table. It was a lighting protocol agreement. Any exterior lighting installed or operated by Le Domaine des Pains Blancs within 800 meters of the property boundary would be required to use shielded, downward-directed fixtures and to comply with a curfew between the hours of 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., with the exception of safety lighting on marked footpaths. The reason was stated plainly at the top of the page: protection of managed pollinator habitat and nocturnal ecology on adjacent agricultural lands. "This is unusual," said the younger lawyer. "It is," Miss Bouchard agreed pleasantly. "It is also non-negotiable." Mr. Falconer had been quiet throughout. Now he looked at Sylvie directly, the way he had not quite managed to do in the driveway 4 years ago. She met his eyes without particular hostility and without warmth. She was simply there, in her kitchen, in her grandmother's chair, with the maples visible through the window and the smell of the sugar shack still in the walls. "These are your terms," he said. It was not quite a question. "They are," she said. He picked up the pen. Mr. Doyle looked at the lighting protocol one more time, then set it down. The younger lawyer made a note. They signed. That was not the end of anything, of course. It was the beginning of a different kind of work. Sylvie used the income from the resort contract to do 2 things. The first was to hire a part-time farmhand, a young woman named Tara, from the agricultural college in St. Hyacinthe, who wanted practical experience and who turned out to have the same quality of focused attention to animals that Sylvie had spent years assuming was rare. The second was to purchase the 40 acres of Crown land lease on the ridge above the Basswood Hollow, converting it to a long-term ecological reserve through a land trust arrangement with a conservation organization in Gatineau. The lease could not be developed. The basswood stand was protected in perpetuity. The living buffer along the eastern fence grew. Within 5 years, the white spruce on the outer row had passed Sylvie's shoulder. The trembling aspen stand had become genuinely a stand dense enough that when you stood on the resort side of the fence, you could not see the farm, and when you stood on the farm side, you could not see the resort and the noise from the other side, the distant occasional helicopter, that hum of guests and generators, and that brought wealthy visitors from the city, was reduced to something Sylvie could sleep through. The red osier dogwood along the creek ditch had filled in so thickly that the ditch had become a habitat, a narrow corridor of willow and dogwood and sedge that held the bank and filtered the runoff, and was, by the time the dogwood reached full maturity, home to more species of nesting songbird than any comparable stretch of ground Sylvie had ever seen. The bees came back fully in the 4th year. Her basswood harvest that July exceeded any yield in Yvette's 8 composition notebooks. She stood at the extractor in the honey house. A small addition Dennis had helped her build onto the equipment shed, and watched the first frames spin, and the honey that came off them was the color of old amber and smelled like something ancient, like the inside of a forest on a hot afternoon, like the land had been saving it up. She did not cry. She was not by nature a person who cried at harvests. She went inside and wrote the date and the yield in a 9th composition, notebook she had bought specifically for this purpose. And she noted that the character was exceptional, and she put the kettle on. The resort's marketing in the years that followed began quietly and then less quietly to feature the partnership. A photograph of the farm stand appeared on their website under the heading Local Connections. The soft cheese began to be listed on the menu by its full name, with a paragraph about the Marceau family's 4 generations on Rang Sainte-Hélène. One summer, a guest who was a documentary filmmaker spent a week at the resort and asked if he could come to the farm to film for an afternoon. Sylvie said yes, within limits, and he produced a short piece that was widely shared, and that described her living windbreak as, she found this precise phrase slightly too dramatic, but she let it stand. An act of defiance that grew into an ecosystem. What she had actually done, she thought, was listen to her grandmother. Le Domaine des Pains Blancs had tried, in the beginning, to make her. Now they included her in their welcome package. She found this funny in a quiet way, the way you find funny the things that once frightened you and no longer have the power to. Mr. Falconer retired. Mr. Doyle was replaced, and then his replacement was replaced. And each new general manager was briefed in their first week on the Marceau farm supply agreement, its terms, its history, and the fact that attempting to renegotiate had been tried once in year 6 and had not gone well for the person who tried it. The agreement had become, in the operational language of the resort, simply a fact of the property, like the granite bedrock and the prevailing northwest wind. In the spring of Sylvie's 41st year, a Saturday morning in the earliest part of maple season when the snow was still shin-deep in the bush, she walked the east fence line with a young woman named Jade, who had recently taken over a small mixed farm 2 concessions north and was struggling with the expansion of a gravel extraction operation near her property boundary. Jade was 26 and capable and frustrated in the specific way of someone who can see a problem clearly and cannot yet see a way through it. They walked the fence line slowly. The spruce on the outer row were now well above their heads. Through them, only the very top floors of the resort's main lodge were visible, and then only in winter, when the deciduous trees had dropped their leaves. The sounds from the other side were faint, almost ambient, the white noise of another world at a respectful distance. "How long did it take?" Jade asked. She ran her hand along the bark of a trembling aspen that was now more than 30 centimeters across at the trunk. 10 years to matter, Sylvie said. Another 5 before I stopped thinking about it. Jade looked at the aspen. 15 years. The years pass anyway, Sylvie said. The question is what's in them. They walked on. A newthhatch was working the bark of one of the spruce, moving in its characteristic head-first spiral, busy with its particular business, indifferent to the resort on the other side, indifferent to the entire human argument of the last decade. My grandmother drew the plan for this, Sylvie said, gesturing at the buffer line. In 1991, she had a different problem, same principle. She never planted it. I found the map after she died. What would have happened if you hadn't found it? Sylvie thought about that honestly. I don't know. Maybe I would have sold. Maybe I would have fought in a way that cost more and got less. Maybe I would have planted something else, something less considered. She paused, but I found it, and it worked. So, Jade said, and looked at the trees again. The hard thing, Sylvie said, is that the people who wanted to push you out are not wrong that they have power. They do have power. A gravel company has more money than you, more lawyers, more equipment, and more patience with discomfort than you would expect. She stopped walking, but their power operates in a short time. It runs on quarters and fiscal years, and the attention span of investors. Your land operates in a different time, decades, generations. If you can stay in the land's time instead of their time, you are playing a game they do not know how to win. Jade nodded slowly. She had the look of someone storing something carefully, the way you put away a tool you know you're going to need. They turned at the north corner and walked back toward the farm buildings. The sugar bush was to their left, the maples just beginning to wake in the cold air, not flowing yet, just thinking about it. The cattle were in the winter shelter, their breath visible through the gaps in the boards. The hive boxes on the edge of the basewood hollow were wrapped in their winter insulation, patient and containing multitudes. Sylvie had never become large. She had never expanded her herd beyond what the land could carry without strain. She had never scaled up her production in response to demand, because she understood, in the way her grandmother had understood, that the demand was for the product of this particular land managed in this particular way, and that if she produced more by changing how she managed the land, she would be producing something else under the same name. And that was a kind of lying she was not willing to do. She was 41. She was tired in the way that people who work with their bodies every day are tired. The kind of tiredness that is also, paradoxically, a form of health. Her knees gave her trouble in cold weather. She had a scar on her left forearm from a fence wire incident in the second planting year that she had never quite had time to get properly stitched. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. That evening, after Jade had gone, Sylvie sat at the kitchen table with the 9 composition notebooks stacked in front of her. She had been thinking for a while about what to do with them. With all of it, the notebooks and the map and the honey house records and the planting logs she had kept through the 15 years of the buffer project, she had been thinking about Tara, who had been with her for 7 years now, and who knew the hives the way Sylvie knew the hives, by sound and smell and the quality of the bees' behavior in different weather. She did not make any announcement about it. She did not frame it as a ceremony. She simply put the notebooks in a canvas bag and walked out to the honey house where Tara was doing the end-of-day inspection and left the bag on the workbench. "What's this?" Tara asked. "The history of the place," Sylvie said, "and some things we haven't tried yet. Read the one from 1991 first. She had ideas we haven't gotten to." Tara opened the bag and looked at the notebooks, touching their spines with the careful curiosity of someone who understands that written records are a form of continuity, not merely information. "How long will you be around to explain them?" "A good while yet," Sylvie said, "but start reading anyway. Don't wait until you need them to know what they say." She walked back to the house. The maples were black against the last of the light. The hive boxes were still. Somewhere in the spruce buffer, a bird she could not identify made a sound she had not heard before. One of the species the buffer had attracted over the years, one of the ones that had moved in when the habitat became real enough to invite them. She stood on the porch and listened. The world had pressed in on her, exactly as Yvette had known it would. It had offered her money and made noise, and tried to convince everyone around her that a small farm on a Quebec hillside was a sentimentality, a resistance to the inevitable, a problem to be solved. And Sylvie had planted trees. She had watered them in drought, and sunk stakes for them in the first ice storms, and replaced the ones she lost and kept planting. She had done the work that was too slow to feel like progress while she was doing it, and that became, without her noticing the precise moment of the change, permanent. The world had adjusted its vision to fit around her. She was still there. The land was still there. The trees, which had been sticks in buckets of water in the back of her cousin's truck, were now a forest, and somewhere inside that forest, 40,000 bees were generating warmth against the cold, keeping their queen alive, doing the patient, invisible work of being exactly what they were. That, Sylvie thought, was enough. That was more than enough.